Welcome to At Home and Abroad with Harrison Walker. Join us each week as we follow our curiosity, diving deep into the familiar and the foreign. Reach beyond your front door as we uncover new perspectives, explore intriguing ideas, and have real conversations with the best guests. Ready for something different? Let's get started.
Walker, I think this is going to be a pretty tough discussion today, but a necessary one. I think it's impossible to live and breathe in our society without being aware of hate.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's terrible, but we have to acknowledge the fact that although hate thrives in the shadows, it does seem to be much more mainstream these days, doesn't it?
Unfortunately so. And at its core, hate is the outcome of that fundamental dichotomy,
Right.
us and them. People hate others that they perceive as immoral or maybe even evil, and those people are somehow a threat to their way of life or security. And most frighteningly, Walker, hate is usually goal-oriented. And the goal? To eliminate its target.
Well, that sends chills up my spine because hate spreads so quickly.
Yeah, it's really scary. As Confucius, the well-known ancient Chinese philosopher, said, it is easy to hate and it is difficult to love.
Well, now I have no idea why that would be the case. It seems to be true, though, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The hard work combating hate is being taken on by many organizations on a global level, the United Nations, all the way to grassroots organizations today.
Yeah, and thank goodness for that, Walker. We are grateful for the opportunity to speak with Hazel Woodrow, Education Program Manager at the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. The Canadian Anti-Hate Network is a nonpartisan, nonprofit, proudly anti-fascist organization with the mandate to counter, monitor, and expose hate-promoting movements, groups, and individuals in Canada, using every legal, ethical, and reasonable tool at their disposal. Hazel holds bachelor's degrees in sociology and social work and brings a trauma-informed approach to hate prevention, intervention, and reparation. Welcome to At Home and Abroad, Hazel.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, we are so excited to chat with you today. This is a very top of mind topic.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So it may seem obvious to many, but I think maybe we should start by defining what hate really looks like in society today. What is hate? And maybe we should also define what hate is not.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's sort of two ways that I'd like to answer this question. One being that a lot of people in Canada don't realize that we actually do have case law that defines what hate speech sounds like, or not just hate speech, hate expression, so things that are written down as well. And it's called the Hallmarks of Hate, and it's a list of 11 different qualities that hateful expression might have. So some of those qualities are things like the targeted group is blamed for all the problems in the world, or the targeted group is portrayed as being uniquely threatening to vulnerable people, so children or animals or elderly people. We see children largely, but also women sometimes are the vulnerable group in question. Other examples would be comparing the targeted group to excrement or vermin, or to using really aggressive and insulting and hostile comparisons, especially comparisons that suggest or that evoke the language of like infestation or the need to exterminate. And these are actually qualities that came up through the case law because they are qualities that hate speech has had across decades and across centuries. For example, so Jews were compared to vermin during the Holocaust, and Muslims in Iraq and Afghanistan were also compared to vermin, to rats, especially. There was this language of like they're hiding out in their like terrorist rat hole kind of thing. Then you need to exterminate their entire families because they breed. And like, so using this language, this really animalistic language that implicitly calls for extermination. So these are just a few examples of what the hallmarks of hate might look like. However, we're at the Anti-Hate Network not only concerned about speech that would meet that legal threshold, because we think that there is speech that leads up to and that bolsters those hallmarks of hate that can be addressed and dealt with before it rises to the level of illegalness. And in that sense, hate is holding exclusionary, hostile, particularly scapegoating views towards targeted groups. So, targeted groups are defined by multiple pieces of legislation, but that would include people of color, Indigenous people, women, 2S LGBTQ plus people, disabled people. So, these are all groups that various human rights legislation across the country have defined to be targets of discrimination and hate over the years.
That's a very good explanation of what hate can look like,
Mm-hmm.
even before it becomes a hallmark of hate
Mm-hmm.
as defined by this case law. So, what is hate not? Because I think sometimes in society, things are immediately labeled, rightly or wrongly,
Yeah.
as hate speech or expression of hate. How do we define that boundary?
It is a tricky boundary, and I think that it's not a boundary that is universally agreed upon,
Hmm.
even among groups that are targets of hate. It's a lot harder, I think, to like suss out exactly where that line is.
Hmm.
And on the one hand, we have the inclination in a lot of social justice spaces that we believe people when they say they are being targets of hate. And on the other hand, we know that this is an increasingly like complex space where, for example, we've seen like we get accused of promoting hate against women because we write about trans exclusionary radical feminism, for example. So it's this tension between this sort of like victims believe targets of hate when they say this is what happened to them, with that people who can be targeted by one type of hate can perpetrate a different kind of hate. And naming that thing is not hateful in and of itself. Hate speech also isn't necessarily just hostile speech or aggressive speech. All of those things, behaving in those ways, can contribute to an environment where people from targeted groups feel less safe participating fully in a democratic society. And so that can contribute to hate movements gaining ground because there's less people out there to fight them and to push back.
Hmm. They gain strength.
Exactly. And so while all of the speech and all the expression that hate movements use is not necessarily what most people would be able to immediately clock as like, oh, that's hate speech. But it's because it's sort of like a diversity of tactics that they use. And some of those tactics are just like attrition and wearing down your enemy.
It's subtle. It's a little bit more
Yeah.
subtle
Yeah,
as they
exactly.
gain strength and power and influence.
Exactly. And
Hmm.
the subtlety is so effective because there are a lot of people out there who aren't able to recognize that the subtlety is strategic and it
Hmm.
is purposeful to get away with carving out and stealing away larger and larger spaces of our public space and of our democracy from the rest of us for themselves.
Yeah, it's that perspective, I think, that sometimes is lacking,
Yeah.
in society at large, that there is an overarching agenda
Mhm.
among hate groups to embolden their message and embolden their position. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And that's why we are also, we talk about that our mandate is focused on the far right and on hate movements and on far right hate. But there are ways that the far right moves and mobilizes that does not maybe necessarily look like hate. So, for example, we might cover something like a head of state or a politician in Canada meeting with a international or European far right politician. Even if there's actually no hate speech exchanged in that interview. It is building the far-right movement, which has the same aims as like overtly exterminatory hate movements.
Yeah, it sends a message.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
So I have to ask, how does hate take root? How do these groups find their feet? Are there commonalities to the proliferation of hate?
So one of the biggest ways that it is spreading now, as opposed to 10 years ago, or certainly 20 years ago, is through the internet.
Yeah.
And that is what has contributed largely to the acceleration of hate movement organizing, because in the past, you would have to call a phone number that the police might have tapped. I'm thinking about like neo-Nazi groups like the Heritage Front in Toronto decades ago, or you might have to go to a rally at someone's house that might be under surveillance. So you're having to, from the very get-go, take a pretty, what would now be considered a more substantial risk than a lot of the people who are involved in and or like dabbling in and around hate movements have taken, because they're sending two-way encrypted messages to each other on Telegram, and there's no way to trace that.
Right.
So that makes it just so much easier to take that first step in. So in terms of the actual participation, it is so much easier than it was before. And there is also the spread of the message, which is fueled by algorithms that are financially incentivized, to push people towards content that makes them outraged and disgusted and elicits a really strong reaction.
And it has such a far reach.
Yes.
Too. Has such a far reach, and people can hide. They can observe these hate groups in motion and become influenced, but they can still stay fairly incognito.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really big issue. And that's why one of the things that I think that we're most proud of at the Anti-Hate Network is the work that we have done exposing people who have tried their very hardest to hide in the shadows for a long time and get away with being overt neo-Nazis and fascists on the internet and do in real life fascist organizing while trying to maintain professional careers in law, in policing, in teaching. Wow. And that's something that we are tremendously proud of, because we don't believe that neo-Nazis have a right to those positions of power and authority and trust in our society.
Absolutely not. And I have to say, I'm very, very glad for the work that you're doing.
Oh, thank you.
That's incredibly important. So we understand that there are these groups, there are factions of society that are promoting hate, but can it be a systemic issue too?
Absolutely. And that's what is referred to in the growing body of literature around hate studies and far-right studies as mainstreaming. And so that's when we see the movement of ideas that would have previously been sort of like hidden in the shadows or not allowed to be tolerated, becoming allowed to be said in public.
Right.
Trump is a really good example.
Yes, I was just going to say, yeah.
And so it wasn't just that you had the presidential candidate for the United States and then the president of the United States saying these things. Part of what contributed to the mainstreaming was the feverishness with which mainstream media, and not just like the far-right Fox News, but all across the 24-hour news cycle in the States, was just like beaming into millions and millions of Americans' homes rhetoric, fascist rhetoric, all day, every day. And so it's not surprising that people grew to be somewhat like used to it in a way. A lot of people continue to be deeply disturbed by that. But the way that it was just such a it's just on the TV all the time. Like there's just the president of the United States, one of the most powerful people in the world, is getting on TV every single day and being fascistic in his language,
validating it.
Yeah, and so people are both being radicalized, and the radicals are looking at the White House and seeing, oh, that's our guy. Like literally when Donald Trump won, the leader of what was then the alt-right movement said, our guy won. And so there's that aspect. And so that's what we talk when we talk about mainstreaming. But the other important part to realize is that it can be very tempting to take the position of, this is not who we are. And when we do that, we are kind of turning a willful blind eye to the fact that fascism is not new in this country. And there have always been people and language that has been hostile and exclusionary and demonizing and scapegoating. So when I say that like the far right ideas have moved into the mainstream, there is like an ebb and flow of far right ideas in and out of the mainstream, because there are many ways that it is less accepted to be outwardly racist now than it used to be.
That is very true.
Yeah.
But I think we've become immune to the hate rhetoric that we do see on, television and radio and podcasts, wherever, whatever medium, because it's almost a daily event, particularly when, certain far right leaders are in power.
Yes. And the choices that get made when it comes to media covering this are really challenging choices. And I don't want to dismiss that. Those are really hard choices to make.
Yeah,
and a
absolutely.
lot of times your like editors and bosses and their bosses' bosses and the people who own the TV station are making those choices for you based on ratings and ad space and that sort of thing. And so that is why fully funded independent journalism is such a foundational aspect of fighting the far right and fighting fascism and fighting hate.
And fundamental to democracy.
Yes.
Right?
We can't have one without the other.
Absolutely not. So we've sort of touched on the fact that the promotion of hate speech, and hateful acts, it exists here in Canada, in the US, around the world. It appears to be, at least to me, on the rise. What can account right now? We talked a little bit about Donald Trump, but what else can account for this upward trend?
Yeah, so I would say there are a few really big, like very super high level issues. And one of them is COVID-19, and one of them is the climate crisis. And these are two things that are affecting the entire globe. So they're very, very big issues. And that means that they are super seductive to people who have a tendency to think in terms of conspiracy theories. Because due to different biases that our brains sometimes do, I think this is called the proportionality bias, which is that we feel like big events have to have, or big monumentous events, world-changing events have to have really big and coordinated causes. And so that's what leads people to think like that rather than a president being assassinated by a lone gunman, that it had to be some like conspiracy among the higher echelons of society to be able to pull that off, as opposed to just like nobody was trying that hard to make sure the president didn't get shot.
Exactly. There could be a simpler explanation.
Yes. So that's where we see a lot of conspiracy theory thinking coming into the COVID-19 pandemic. And that was just like rocket fuel for the conspiracy theory movements. And while not all conspiracy theories are hateful, all universally hateful ideologies, hateful belief systems contain within them conspiracy theories. I think that we often forget that anti-Semitism, which is foundational to most hate movements, is a conspiracy theory. It is based in conspiracy theories about Jews. I really like the definition that I've heard our chair emeritus, Bernie Farber, use, which is anti-Semitism is rumors about Jews.
Yeah.
And so I think about that a lot. So that's where the conspiracy theory angle of all of this comes in. And one of the things that we know through a very early burgeoning field of conspiracy theory studies is that one of the single best predictors of belief in one conspiracy theory is already believing in a different conspiracy theory.
In another one.
And so that's how believing in something that feels innocuous, like the moon landing being faked or something like that, something that feels like, well, does it matter? Does it not matter which one I believe? Whatever.
Right.
That is priming us to think about the world in terms of conspiracy theories. And that's really dangerous.
Yeah, it's very, very dangerous.
Oh, the other part that I mentioned about the climate crisis and how that is, there are both conspiracy theories involved there in terms of beliefs it's not real, that it is being faked by globalists or whoever in order to decrease the population, and there's going to be mass cullings and that sort of thing. And then at the same time, it is right in everybody's faces. We are seeing mass flooding and forest fires and catastrophe that is forcing people to flee their homes. And so the forced migration that is coming out of the climate crisis is fueling a lot of far-right conspiracy theories and beliefs about invasion and the threat that so-called mass immigration poses to the so-called West and white people, essentially. And this is something that will just continue. There's no reason to believe that there won't be imminently, within every year for probably forever, continuing climate catastrophe that will push people out of their homes and their communities and their countries of origin into spaces where
they can live.
Yes, where they can live, but where far-right politicians have been fomenting fear and hate and scapegoating of those people. And it's going to get just so ugly.
The clashes we're already seeing it in some areas of the world, but those clashes will become even more pronounced and divisive and, I hate to say it, violent.
Yeah, and that's not even to speak about the rise of ecofascism, which is basically a fascist response to climate crisis that prioritizes white people surviving and white people's blood and soil relationship to the land at the expense of, the mass death of the people of the global majority and racialized people. So lots of angles.
Lots of angles, and some of them quite terrifying.
Yeah.
Hazel, I was wondering if you could quantify the number of hate groups operating in Canada right now.
I will say I can't. And there's a reason for that, which is that hate movements are inherently fractious, and they coalesce and then they break apart and they come back together and they have infighting. And I think, based on, spending hundreds, probably thousands of hours in reading these chat rooms and all that over the last several years, I find that these spaces are full of very authoritarian and domineering personalities who don't play well with others.
Okay.
And so their social movements do what all social movements do, which is, they come together and they break apart. But there is just such overt and open hostility laterally within them that's what contributes to some of this, getting together and breaking apart and whatnot. And the other reason is that we're seeing a move, a conscious move on behalf of particularly fascist activists away from, we have a membership registry and we have like, this is the list of names and this is the leader, to a more cell-based model. There's an ability to be autonomous, and that makes it so that if any one group gets in trouble, they can't take the whole network down with them. And so that there's a thinking when those folks are doing it, it is strategic, and the strategy is to protect the longevity of the movement by making sure that even if one of them gets caught, planning to like attack infrastructure or something, they don't know enough about any of the other groups to be able to like rat them out and take them down with them. And then on the other hand, we just see that among the broader far right, I'm not just talking about like fascists and neo-Nazis, that there is just this continuing kind of like coming together and breaking apart because sometimes the interests diverge. For example, in the so-called parental rights movement and in the 1 Million March for Children spaces that I monitor, which is a very like loose collective network movement of people who oppose the full inclusion and participation and celebration of diverse gender identities and sexual orientations, particularly with respect to spaces that children learn and exist in, really. And last spring, we saw a really interesting and disturbing alliance formed between a lot of people on the Christian far right, or Christian fundamentalists, and a lot of Muslim fundamentalists who were together both concerned about the fact that traditional gender roles and norms about families and sexual orientation and sexuality and all of this were being disrupted, and that their children were being exposed to this and learning about this in schools. And so we have this, like, there's a cooperation, we're coming together. And then we get around to the fall, and we have October 7th happen. And some of those people remain in community and collaboration with one another. But there are also many, many Christian Zionists among the Christian fundamentalists who are now finding themselves in opposition to the Muslims in these groups that they are, like the Facebook groups and stuff. And I see a lot of infighting and tension. And that's where we see the situation of the like cause du jour is sort of constantly shifting.
Right.
And that people are moving in and out of opposition to certain events and causes and whatnot. And that's also what contributes to that, to the more networked way that this is working.
Sounds like it's more complicated than ever before.
Certainly. And people often, like, quote unquote, belong to many different networks. I can't overstate the role that like personality really does have with this, in that sometimes we see groups like fracturing off just because somebody wanted to be the boss and they weren't going to be able to be the boss under the current leader or whatever. And I mean, we would celebrate that because now the group is like less strong because it's fractured. So that's great. There's a lot of angles to the whole issue of like why this is no longer a membership list group situation, and it's so much more fluid than that.
Right. I imagine some could be growing as well as people with the rise of the internet are looking for meaning.
Absolutely. Yep. And especially young people. Young people are being, what I am seeing is being so attracted to radicalism of all kinds right now, because like what else do we have in the face of climate crisis and a crisis of public health care and education and all of these other things that are going on, and that young people had their formative developmental years through the isolation of the COVID-19 pandemic. Like, there's nothing surprising at all about the turn to radicalism. And I don't think that is an inherently bad thing, because I don't think radicalism is inherently a bad thing. But some of those young people are turning to the radicalism of the far right. And it's a radicalism that is causing them to turn on their peers and is exploiting their youth and their need for identity development and meaning making in order to push them into situations and activities that are bad for them, that are bad for their communities, and that really only benefit the adults involved. I think there's a lot of exploitation that goes on there.
So, can you explain for us how the Canadian Anti Hate Network and other entities seek to combat this hate in our society, not just here, but beyond our borders as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So we take currently it's kind of a two-pronged approach. And one of those prongs is how we started out, which was as a watchdog slash like reporting investigative organization. And through that, we do both like daily current events reporting, and then we also do longer form investigative pieces that sometimes involve infiltration into hate movements. And then the second prong that emerged a couple of years after the organization really got its feet is our education program, which I run. And that is dedicated to really all forms of education. So I do education around what are hate movements? What do they sound like? What do they look like? How to know if someone that you care about is getting involved in them, how to talk to them about that. So it's sort of a very holistic thing. And that's the approach that we take. And the hope is that with those tools, both the like knowledge and understanding of what hate movements are and what do they look like. And that I think comes out of the reporting that is mostly done by my really excellent colleague, Peter. And then there's also the education piece that we are helping and we are giving people the tools that they need to take this fight on in their own communities, because hate emerges on the far right, emerges and thrives in local contexts where it can speak to the concerns and grievances of a local population. And that's why I think it's so valuable for people to be able to take what they learn from us and from other organizations like ours and then use use whatever works and leave whatever doesn't for their context. We also, in terms of like both at home and abroad, we always talk about this as being a transnational movement due to just like financial constraints. Also, there's only 4 of us. We have to focus our reporting on Canada, but we are constantly pointing to the transnational connections that these movements have. They learn from each other transnationally, both in like strategy. There's training that goes on overseas. There's conferences that happen all over the world and networking. In that sense, it functions like any other transnational social movement in terms of what is learned from one another.
You certainly have a big job on your hands.
Yes, I think we do, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think probably one of the most important questions we have for you today is this one, in terms of, the simple fact that people are often afraid to confront hate. But history tells us, that to turn a blind eye can be catastrophic. And I'm just wondering how we can safely and courageously combat hate in our communities when we're seeing our fellow citizens having to deal with hate. It's really hard to see, especially now, seeing some people who are dealing with hate and not a lot of people standing up for them in our own communities here. I'm speaking specifically to some of our Jewish citizens in Canada. I'm just wondering, how can we courageously do this?
So I think first to think about safety is that there's safety in numbers. And so maybe when it comes to within our own communities, maybe it's not safe to do something alone, to be a lone voice. But it is a lot safer to do it with a bunch of other people. There's also, I think, a question of if my neighbor is unsafe and under threat from hate groups, far right movement, how much safety do I deserve to be preserving of my own? And how much do I deserve to be just like fixated on my own perceptions of my own safety when I think about like we are all safer when we are all freer and free from hate? And so in that sense, there may need to be a sacrifice of one's personal safety or personal feelings of safety, because those are not always the same thing, in order to move towards a safer future for everybody. So doing it as a team. It's like, this is a team endeavor. This is for everybody and by everybody. And remembering that there are so many different ways that it can look. It might look like taking to the streets, and it might look like delegating at your city council. Cannot overstate how valuable that is. I've been told that by librarians, by public workers, because the far right loves to just go out and monologue at city council meetings, at school board meetings. Those, elected officials might know that there's a whole bunch of people out there who disagree with them. But if the only people who show up are people who hate queer and trans people, for example, that's what policy gets passed based on, is the people who show up to participate in the democratic process. So doing those kinds of things is really valuable. There's also the psychosocial emotional support angle of taking care of people who have been targeted by hate and asking them, what do they need? Do they need somebody to ride the bus with them if they've been harassed on a bus or something like that? Do they need somebody to watch their kids while they go to trauma therapy after being attacked? There's a lot of different ways that this can look, and it's really the only limits are your imagination, because there's also a lot of really creative and exciting ways that it can look as well.
Well, this is really interesting, because I know we've talked a lot about the far right here, but I know that there are a lot of people in the Jewish community who claim that their far left friends are not supporting them and not being public and supportive, and they're afraid, especially if they're on social media, that they're going to be ostracized by the left.
Yeah, like you, I feel deeply for those, for people who are experiencing that. And I would just reissue the call to everyone, including people on the left, to make sure that we are not leaving anyone behind in the fight for liberation.
Hate is hate.
Yeah, and that it doesn't make anybody freer to make people, innocent civilians, afraid to just move throughout the world and to participate in public society. That's something that we just see as such an effective tool that hate uses and hate movements use. Is you just have to make it unpleasant enough for the people that you hate and disagree with to not want to hang out with you or in your spaces or come to city council meetings. Like, that might be another really big thing to do. If your friend wants to delegate a city council meeting and they are part of a targeted group, you say, I will come with you and I will stand behind you while you talk. And I won't say anything, but I will stand behind you while you talk, so that people know that people have your back. Mm-hmm. So I would just reiterate that people don't get freer by making others who are innocent civilians feel afraid and alienated, and their only supporters are racists or Islamophobes or something like that. Like, we don't want people to feel like that. Yeah, I think that's something that is often not thought all the way through, is like, what are the consequences from a social movement building perspective? And anti-fascism is a social movement, among other things, to making people feel like nobody's in their corner while they are being targets of hate and of bigotry from many different kinds of people, including targets of mass murder by neo-Nazis. Like, we can't, that it's absurd and outrageous to leave Jewish people out of anti-fascism right now.
Well, it's certainly a complicated time.
Yes.
What is the greatest challenge facing the Canadian anti-hate network today, would you say?
I think we need, I wish that we could be so much bigger. I wish that our capacity was stronger. And so that, I think, would look like being able to grow our team. There's only 4 of us. There have only been 4 of us. and that's including our executive and deputy director, it would be so monumental to be able to have more staff. And one of the things that like blue sky thinking, I would love to be able to accept and support and care for all of the people who email us and say, I want to volunteer with you. And we kind of have to say, like, we don't have the capacity to take on volunteers in anti-fascist research and in the risks that this work involves in our current iteration in a like ethical and caring way, because I don't think I have the capacity to have a duty of care to a volunteer. And so I would love to be able to accept that those offers of support. And people freelance write for us and will feed us tips, and like that's all great. But in terms of actually robust volunteer program, there's a lot of people who want to help, and we just sort of have to say, like, focus on your own communities, which will always be true. That will always be where we will encourage people to do the work. But to be able to grow the network in a really kind of high level sort of way, not just the people who are employed by CAN, but people who are part of the like broader network of those that are involved in anti-hate work and anti-fascist work in Canada.
Well, this has certainly been an eye-opening conversation. I'm sure I speak for Heather and myself. With the many hats you and your team members are wearing, we are very grateful, Hazel, for taking the time to speak with us today. If you are the victim of a hate crime or have been witness to a hate crime, please reach out to your local law enforcement agency. You may also learn more or find inspiration on how to combat hate in your community. You can find the Canadian Anti-Hate Network online at antihate.ca. Thank you very much, Hazel.
Thank you so much for having me, Heather and Lauren. This has been just a really excellent conversation.
Walker, their work is so incredibly important if we're going to have even a hope of combating this rising tide of hate groups.
After the Holocaust, the world said never again. But it seems to be happening again and again.
Yeah.
In living memory, there's been the Cambodian genocide, the Rwandan genocide, the Rohingya refugee crisis, and more. And all of these atrocities are preceded by extreme and relentless hate speech.
Yeah, they are. And of course, hate speech doesn't have to be actual words. Right? It can take the form of symbols, photographs, graphics. And it also has the help of AI now, too. And then there's the intimidation, which can take so many different forms, like vandalism, physical aggression, violent attacks, you name it.
This is where things get really scary, Harris.
Yeah.
As I mentioned in our interview with Hazel, we have definitely heard from our Jewish friends that they are feeling intimidated and unsafe in many spaces due to the rise in anti-Semitism after the attack on Israeli civilians on October 7th. But they are not alone, are they?
No, sadly no. Where we live in Toronto, Canada, Walker, there have been approximately 190 hate crime incidents in this city as of mid-March this year. Doubtlessly, that number has grown by now. But at the time, 56% of those hate crimes were anti-Semitic in nature, with LGBTQ2 plus people the second largest targeted group. People in the Black community and of the Muslim faith were also victims. And frankly, when any of our population feels unsafe, we should all feel unsafe.
Absolutely. Most definitely. It doesn't matter who you are. And you know what, Harris? It doesn't feel safe out there.
No.
Social media seems to be dishing out a whole boatload of disinformation and hateful propaganda.
Oh, yeah, I see it all the time. And what's really scary, though, Walker, is that adults under 30 are now almost as likely to trust information from social media sites as they are to trust information from national news outlets with professional journalists at the helm. And let's be real, a lot of that content on social media is not accurate, is manipulated and pushed out purposefully to support some pretty nefarious agendas.
Yes, in fact, a new study conducted earlier this month by BBC Education found that nearly half of young people ages between 11 and 16 tend to believe the news they're seeing on social media often regardless of the source.
Yikes.
Also, users of all ages often tend to trust almost anything a friend, relative, or a colleague shares with them. Think about that.
I know. That's pretty crazy. It kind of reminds me of that saying of, remember when we were in the 80s, what our parents would say to us? They would say, so, are you going to go jump off that cliff if your friend does?
Well, yeah, and it reminds me of the telephone game where you say one bit of information and then it goes on to the next person and then next person.
Yeah.
Then the facts are not what the original facts were, what were being said originally.
In the beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah. But seriously, more disinformation combined with hate speech circulating out there, the more traction that hate is going to get. And so it grows, leading to deepening discrimination and even large-scale violence and sometimes genocide. Yeah. Have you heard of the illusory truth effect?
No, what is that?
So the illusory truth effect is the tendency to believe that false information is correct after being repeatedly exposed to it. And it's pretty obvious and totally annoying that the algorithms push the same info to us over and over. Info they think that we're more likely to read.
Well, you know what? There's also the confirmation bias, right? Mm-hmm. People tend to look for or interpret information that is consistent with their own opinions and beliefs, whether good, bad, or hateful.
Yeah. Take, for example, the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar. There was a rise there in ultranationalism, likely emboldened by the election of Donald Trump, right, in 2016. The Rohingya were singled out as illegal immigrants, and quickly, hate messaging was being relentlessly disseminated across Facebook. And Facebook in Myanmar is one of the main sources of communication among the leaders of the nation, the military, and also the common people. So it is the platform that people go to for news. And the platform was spreading hate speech, propaganda, dangerous rumors, doctored images and videos, and they were inciting violence, which contributed to the brutal murder of thousands of people, the rape of an untold number of women and girls, and the panicked exodus of 700,000 people to refugee camps in neighboring Bangladesh.
It's horrific.
Yeah.
It's so important that we are educated consumers of content.
Yeah.
We have to become more aware and question what we read. There is fake news out there, right?
Yeah.
Maybe not what Trump was pointing at back in his presidency, but there is bad info that is put out there to deceive people. Mm-hmm. We need to be smart.
We do need to be smart. And there are a few ways to fact check now, right? Websites like Snopes.com, PolitiFact, or BreakTheFake.ca will debunk disinformation, and BBC Verify has also launched a transparency tool.
Right. I've heard about that.
Yeah. The BBC News has introduced a very cool new content credentials feature, which confirms where an image or video has come from and how its authenticity has been verified. It also uses new technology to embed this information within the image or video itself, helping to counter disinformation when the content is shared outside the BBC.
That.
Yeah. But really, Walker, how many kids, how many youth are going to fact check? I know adults who believe everything they read.
Well, it's interesting you say that because I used to have a friend who used to read multiple newspapers a week from different countries so they could get different opinions on the recent
trying to find the nuggets of truth.
Events that have happened. But who has time for that?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It comes down to that. We're a busy society.
Yeah, and we have
people
no
just
attention
won't
span.
do that.
Yeah.
The answer is education, I guess, and trying to get Meta and others to clean up their platforms.
Yeah, in my opinion, social media, it's a scourge, Walker, for so many reasons.
Do you remember the conspiracy theory that was circulating about the wildfires in Maui?
Yeah, I do.
Oh, gosh. Yeah. Some joker posted a transformer explosion that actually happened in Chile, but claimed that it was evidence for the U.S. government starting those devastating fires themselves.
Which is ridiculous. It was all over the internet. And of course, there are people who still believe it. Shocking. Or what about the conspiracy theory that believes that the world is in danger of being taken over by lizard people?
Nice. They even thought Queen Elizabeth was reptilian, Harris.
Like, come on. Queen Elizabeth? Oh my God, madness. But as crazy as they are, these conspiracy theories eat away at our trust, making it difficult to differentiate fact from fiction, letting hate grow, divisions deepen, and violence to rise. I once heard someone somewhere say, what happens when no one believes anyone? It's terrifying to contemplate. Thank you for joining us at Home and Abroad with your host, Harrison Walker. If you enjoyed this episode, you would be a real gem if you would rate and review our show. It helps us to grow and expand our reach. You can also subscribe to follow us each week as we continue the conversation. Find us on Instagram at @HarrisonWalker or visit us at www.harrisonwalker.com. We have great merch, just saying. And of course, we would love to hear from you.